Hello and welcome to International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. This is a weekly program which we curate for the aspirants of the Indian Civil Service examinations. Our effort is to focus on issues and personalities and events that impinge on India's national interest and have an impact on our foreign policy formulation and its implementation. We are trying to juggle around with different formats which suit you best. So what we'll do is that we'll give you background and analysis to various issues which are important. These will be slightly longer presentations where we'll talk to you for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, 35 minutes. And then in response to the requests which we have received from the people who are preparing, we will also have some short introductions. These would be taking care of the developments of significance in international relations, which have taken place over a week, over 10 days, and then try to discuss these as they go. So you are au courant. You are never behind the step in the current events scheme. But when you want a background, you can always revisit one of our earlier conversations and fill yourself up on the background. What I wish to discuss with you this week is, in this edition, the dynamic diplomatic developments which have taken place over past week to 10 days. And these are China's diplomatic overtures to bring peace to Ukraine and come out with a 12. Chinese president has come out during his visit to Moscow with a 12-point peace plan. It has been welcomed by the Russians. The Ukrainian president has been in two minds and not dismissed it out of hands, but he doesn't know how seriously to take it. The Americans, of course, and its Western allies have dismissed it as a stratagem by Putin to buy a temporary respite and build up his military positions in Ukraine. We shall discuss this at some length. The other interesting diplomatic developments have been the Australian and Japanese prime ministers' visit to India. Now, these visits were planned from before and they took place. But what is interesting is that they almost coincide with the Chinese diplomatic initiative or overtures, whatever you call, in Russia about Ukraine. And Australian and Japanese prime ministers are two Quads prime ministers who have visited India in quick succession to emphasize the special relationship with India. But first things first, the China's diplomatic overtures. The Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Russia for 2 days, and there was a usual joint statement issued, the display of bonhomie. It is the friendship which is better than any other friendship. It is everlasting. It is Putin said, this is the best friend I have is the Chinese president. Chinese president reciprocated without being so personal, individualistic, but he said that China and Russia stand together, and they probably are the best guarantors of the emerging world order, which is going to be more equitable, which is going to be rule-based, which is going to be respecting international law, etc., etc. Now, some people might find this ironical because if you use the Western lenses to view the developments, the Chinese would appear to be the people who are violating other people's sovereignty, who are violating territorial boundaries, which have not always conducted themselves according to the norms of international law and diplomatic behavior. But then if you look at it from the Chinese perspective or the Russian perspective, it is quite clear that the Americans who criticize China so stringently themselves have not bound their diplomatic conduct or even their military interventions, either with respect to the international law or diplomatic conventions. Take it, the regime change in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, their relationship with Iran, under ex-President Trump's reign, the trade war, unilaterally tariffs being imposed on Russia and China. So all this would, to the eyes of any objective analyst, appear as gross violation of international norms and application of double standards. So this is what makes the Chinese effort to play a more substantial, significant role in the emerging world order. You keep it in mind, the Chinese had also pulled a ace out of their sleeves, if one might use the cards metaphor, when they brought out this peace between, if not peace, actually, normalization of relationship, the rapprochement between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Saudi Arabs. There have been violations of ceasefire which were there right after the aftermath of this announcement. But I think the long-drawn conflicts don't die out so easily. You could also say that the Western allies would, totally rattled by the Chinese diplomatic dynamism in the Middle East, are not going to take it very easily, particularly the Israelis, who seem to have been wrong-footed in this very badly. But let's get back to the Chinese determined dynamic diplomacy in Russia. So the two met in the backdrop of the Saudi-Iranian coup, diplomatic coup which Chinese had pulled up. But the new surge of diplomacy displays that the Chinese are trying to project themselves that China as a senior partner and Russia with it is probably going to be an alternative model of emerging world order, not the hegemonistic blueprint which America, in cahoots with its Western allies, is trying to impose on the rest of the world. That is the imposition of democracy from the top, imposition and insistence on human rights regime, which is defined by them. And let's not forget that the Chinese have always maintained that they have nothing against the rule-based system, but they should have been a party to drawing up of those rules, international legal regimes, which are being imposed on them. So if one looks at the evolution of international law and diplomatic regimes as a Western construct, the Chinese position seems to be quite valid. It's not only the Chinese who feel so. The major Islamic countries also feel that they have been forced to toe the American line, because for ever since Cold War and ever since the Saudi Arabs drew close to Americans, the Americans have tried to impose their worldview on the rest of them. There is a brilliant book which has come out recently. Has China Won is the title, written by a Singaporean diplomat, come academician, come best-selling author Kishore Mahbubani, who argues that if you look objectively, the Chinese seem to have a fairer worldview, a more equitable adjustment with people. They are obviously, like any big power, trying to remain number one in the emerging world order, but they probably provide a little more space. And the whole analysis which Kishore has done in his book about the rest of the world, the Americans say that the Chinese try to trap everybody in the debt trap, whether it's Sri Lanka, Pakistan, African countries, Nepal, Myanmar, etc., Bangladesh. But if you look at it, the kind of conditionalities which the America-led IMF and World Bank imposed on developing countries and forced them to follow a particular economic model of development, which links them, makes them dependent on the Western perspective of globalization, is something which you can't remain blind to. The Ukrainian president obviously showed only cautious optimism. He said that he is always willing to talk. He is willing to negotiate directly with Putin. But he also has made it very clear that he will not accept any settlement which is surrendering of any Ukrainian territory. Now, you see, the Americans can fight a war till the last Ukrainian. Americans are not paying a price in terms of loss of lives, not even the number of lives they lost in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in elsewhere. But the point is, they are making Ukraine the scapegoat to keep fighting and the cannon fodder for Western democracy, for NATO, and for the security of Eastern Europe, and then the rest of the Europe together. Having a choice, Ukraine probably would like to negotiate, but can Ukraine negotiate independently? It is so dependent for its survival as of this moment on the Western military assistance, for the Western economic assistance, and the Russians probably, from the American point of view and the Western point of view, cannot be trusted. But then again, there are two perspectives on this. The provocations which the West has repeatedly extended to Putin make Putin very wary of trusting any assurances which Americans or the Western allies or the European Union might bring. So this is the context in which US, of course, has outright rejected it. The US Secretary of State, Blinken, is one of those people who thinks that ultimately a negotiated settlement will come about in Ukraine when both sides tire. But it's interesting, in this both sides tiring, Russia and Ukraine are paying a heavy price in terms of loss of lives, in terms of economic development being affected, being exposed to sanctions. But this is what the Americans are not doing. No European power is directly paying this kind of a price either. So this is what makes it difficult to see what will be the outcome of this peace initiative. The first time item in the Chinese peace plan is which calls for respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Now, this is what is, some people find it ironical, but has the United States respected the sovereignty of all countries all the time in its diplomatic interactions with them? Take the case of Latin American countries, take the countries in Central America, take the countries even in the Middle East. So I think this is something to call Russian invasion is the only exception, or to call Chinese the only aggressive actor in international relations seems to be fraught with difficulties. This is a chart which you might have a quick look at your convenience. It shows that how, despite all the differences which the West has tried to create between Ukraine and the Chinese, the trade revenue of Ukraine as late as 2021 was showing a decided predominance of its trade with China. You have China, you have Russia, you have the only European country which figures prominently in this is Germany. This is all figures are in US dollars and in billions, so you can have a look at it. The second chart is even more interesting, which gives you a breakdown of the volume of trade, the nature of trade, what is exported, what is imported. But by the time we come to 2021, from 2016, which is after the Russian usurpation of Crimea, you will see that the trade has grown steadily, and these figures are almost about 2 years back, but there's a major increase in this. China's diplomatic overtures are inspired by the confidence that China has become Russia's main trading partner after the sanctions imposed by the West on it. It is not only the import of discounted oil, it is also the Russian declaration, which was made during the joint declaration during this visit, that by 2030, they will have a new pipeline redirecting the gas from Russia to China instead of Europe. So ever since the Nord Stream 2 was sabotaged, there has been this discussion. But the more the Russians rely on the Chinese, to balance there, it might be the nature of the trade might change. You also have almost 30% of Russia automobile sector has become dependent by the figures available in November 2022, 30% on the Chinese. The Chinese companies, again, we should not forget, are interconnected with various Western companies, whether it is auto parts, whether it is electronics, whether it is chip-based systems. So this is going to be a rather complicated scheme to untangle. Does all this mean something for Taiwan? So there is always this calculation that what lessons is China learning from the war in Ukraine or its relationship with Russia? Will it be emboldened to make a bid to take over Taiwan a la Russia in Ukraine, or at least put pressure on it? Or is it only going to be a shadow boxing, a battle of nerves with America in an election year to secure? Well, let's not forget that even the United States of America has accepted the one China principle. So in this case, China is not violating the territorial boundaries, integrity, or sovereignty of another country. It is only trying to reclaim what has been forcibly taken away in its eyes from it itself. It was the same case as Hong Kong. Hong Kong was on a long-term lease to Britain, and Britain, when it returned, was returning Chinese territory to China, People's Republic of China, and was adding conditions that a different system of governance should stay there. So, which was a bit odd situation. At that moment of time, China probably found it useful, but today China doesn't have to make any compromises of that kind to regain its own territory. But then when people talk of will Taiwan go the Hong Kong way, is again interesting, because Taiwan is the largest manufacturer of integrated chips printed circuits, integrated circuits in the world, and China probably would not like to unsettle the apple cart because it might hurt its own economy and it might have repercussions elsewhere. Also, let's not forget that Taiwan is a democracy compared to various other countries, although the democracy index is again manipulated by the Western countries, the Americans, and the American media lays great emphasis on it. But let's concede, for the argument's sake, that Taiwan is very much a democracy with a multi-party political system. And there is a party called Kuomintang, the party formed with Chiang Kai-shek, which has a major plank in its manifesto to reunite with China, because they think that they were the legitimate government in China when the communists took over. So if they want to be reunited and have the whole China as one unit, if that party comes to power, it might be far easier for China to reunite and without any use of force or threat of use of force. If that happens, the West again would have to cope with the situation. Right now, it can build diplomatic pressure by a high-ranking American politician visiting Taiwan, the US Air Force making a display of power, maritime exercise taking place, and China would respond this by either mounting military, naval, aerial exercises of its own, or checking the US incursions into Taiwanese airspace. Because it would, both sides claim the Taiwanese airspace would theoretically, if you accept the one China principle doctrine, that it is Chinese airspace as well. So the Chinese planes are flying within the airspace. So the whole issue boils down to the freedom of navigation in high seas and freedom of the skies. But that is, again, if China is powerful enough, it can claim that it has a more legitimate excuse for mounting these military exercises guarding its own borders than far away America has. How does India respond to all this is going to be interesting for us, because India cannot concede that having a border dispute with China, China is not an aggressive violator of territorial integrity of other countries. Historically, the Chinese have never accepted the McMahon line. They have never accepted the 1914-16 the agreements which were reached in Shimla about the watershed principle and the Tibetan boundaries. It has consistently argued it is willing to settle it on the basis of negotiations. There has been a long history of quid pro quos offered by China, but again the issue is, can India trust China enough to take a risk? But at the same time, India's trade with China, despite the border dispute, despite the Galwan incident, despite the COVID pandemic, has increased manyfold. So this problem would remain for India to tackle how to cope with China's diplomatic overtures, dynamic diplomacy, not only in Middle East, but in Europe now, and also maybe quickly followed in Africa. On the other side, the India has not given up its diplomatic efforts to countervail China, particularly in areas of vital strategic interest to it, in South China Sea, in Indian Ocean, and some of it has been under inspiration and encouragement by the United States of America, the formation of the Quads. So two prime ministers of Quads countries visited India in quick succession. Australian Prime Minister was the first to visit India, and the Australian Prime Minister's visit to India covered a whole range of issues where agreement was publicly articulated. But two things there. Just before the Australian Prime Minister's visit to India, Albanese, there had been some violence against Indian places of worship in Australia. This is a pattern which you can see, the Khalistanis assaulting the Indian High Commission in the United Kingdom. They become, and those countries saying that what can we do? We are democracies, we allow political refugees to indulge in political activities and dissent and so on. So all this argument cuts both ways. So India had to retaliate and remove the security cordon from outside the British High Commissioner's house. And then, of course, the security was restored to the Indian High Commission. But the Australian Prime Minister, the moment he came to India, assured Indians that strict steps would be taken, that this kind of a thing is not repeated. The one other important thing is there's a very large Indian population of Indian students in Australia. And there is always some irritants about the equivalence of the degrees and so on. So this time it was agreement which was made that Indians would, both sides would have mutually recognized educational qualifications acquired in one country and treated at par. This may take some time, but an announcement was made that at least one university, Deakin University, would set up an off-campus, off-site campus in India, and this might begin the process. So Indo-Australian relationship has grown in terms of import of coal, in terms of mineral resources, and besides India has been raised from a strategic partner to a comprehensive strategic partner, and this will probably encourage also the volume of trade and the nature of trade changing. So this visit had no irritants, so to speak. And the journey of the Australian Prime Minister began with a highly publicized chariot victory lap done in a cricket match in Ahmedabad in a stadium named after Prime Minister Modi, where India and Australia were playing. It was very interesting. It was a great media opportunity. And some people thought that the Australian Prime Minister was not very comfortable with this tamasha, but he knows which side of the bread is buttered. If Indian business is to be acquired, then of course the whims of the Indian leaders have to be accepted as well. And cricket, of course, is a passion in both countries. So this is what you might have a closer look at what happened during this visit in this. The key outcomes were, of course, the agreement about critical minerals being imported, comprehensive free trade. This is only being talked about. The comprehensive free trade agreement has been talked about for long. It has not been signed, but now it appears that over the next few years, this also might be accomplished. We have already talked about the mutual recognition of educational qualifications. Then we come to the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to India. The Japanese Prime Minister, Kishida, embarked on a 2-day trip almost in the immediate aftermath of the Australian Prime Minister. The Japanese Prime Minister has also tried to build bridges with South Korea in the East Asian geography, where there have been irritants in the relationship which go back centuries, when Korea was part of the imperial colonial empire of China, where the Japanese during the Second World War abused Korean citizens. The women who were abused as pleasure women for Japanese soldiers has been an issue for which Japan took a long time to either pay compensations or to apologize, but all this is a thing of past. So Japanese have tried to build up their bridges with South Korea, and they also have laid emphasis that their relationship with India is very, very important. He has invited, the Japanese Prime Minister during his visit, invited the Indian Prime Minister to visit Japan next year for a G7 meeting. This can be counted as a major diplomatic breakthrough for India, because otherwise India would not be sitting at the G7 high table at all. But the host country invites the Indian Prime Minister, and this seems to be the constructive outcome, the rich dividend of the G20 meetings organized by the Prime Minister of India in quick succession, and this is there. The Chinese territorial claims in East Asia and in South China Sea are something of common concern to both Japan and India. While India might not like to make Quad sound like a military alliance, but the Chinese look at it as a NATO in Asia. And again, this is going to be an interesting challenge for India to how it balances its activities in Quads and its relationship with China. The Japanese Prime Minister's visit has to be analyzed in a much larger context. We have already referred to its relationship with Korea. We must see that Japan has a little problem in managing an even keel in relationship with Southeast Asian other countries, particularly ASEAN countries, because many of them have major trade partnerships with China. And they also have memories of the Japanese occupation of their countries during the Second World War, when Japan ultimately was defeated, but the memories remain of quote-unquote atrocities. But there are certain issues in which the Japanese have a major advantage. Japan is the only country in the world which has had to suffer a nuclear attack in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So nobody can lecture to Japanese on violation of human rights. I mean, in a war, atrocities are committed by both sides. We are watching this in the Ukraine war, whether it is Ukrainian nationalists defending or Russian aggressors. But 50 years ago, 60 years ago, what the Japanese did, they paid a price for that, which no other country in the world has paid. So Japanese have again made two interesting things, that they would like to be independent in defense of their territory, their way of life which they are used to, and they would like to get back to a position where the Japanese economic miracle was supposed to be propelling whole of Asia. But in the meantime, the little dragons, little tigers, call them whatever you may, have left Japanese a little behind. So the Japanese themselves have a lot of problems in domestic politics since Abe's assassination, since Abe first abdicated from power, and lots of economic reforms are required, political party reforms are required, maybe the mindset which is not going back to a monarchy and is much more modern has to be there. And all this, I think, provides an opportunity for India to partner with Japan, diplomatic initiatives, not only in the limited areas and geographies where our strategic interests coincide, but elsewhere in the world also. There have been some instances of this, like in neighborhood in Sri Lanka, but they can be done elsewhere as well. So how do we conclude? The conclusion is interesting. The dynamic diplomacy undertaken by China and the Quad's prime ministers, and an equally, shall we say, alert response by India, makes us realize that the various multipolar alliances are taking place, situation is in a flux, power equations are changing, and Indian foreign policy is confronted both with challenges and opportunities. The Indian Prime Minister is expected to travel to Washington for a state visit later in the summer. He's been invited by President Biden. Delhi would also have the chance to host both Putin and Xi twice over in the coming months, both for the SCO summit and G20 summit. The Pakistani foreign minister has, of course, thrown a spanner in the works and walked out of the SCO foreign ministers meet recently by showing a provocative red flag, showing Indian territories as part of Pakistan. But then the Pakistan's participation in SCO is not as important for India as the other big twos coming to India and participation. The stage seems to be set for a major restructuring of the world order, and Indian geopolitical long-term vision will have to keep this in mind and work for a space where India can have not only an autonomous strategy, but also commensurate with its weight, its population, the size of its economy, play. It cannot be subordinate to China in Asia, but at the same time, it cannot be a camp follower of the United States of America and the Western world. So we are back again to the early days of the non-aligned movement at the end of the Cold War. There may not be a Cold War at the moment, but this churn is on. Think about it and go over the PDF more than once, and maybe if you feel like it, have a look at the book which I have done on international relations, particularly for the use of IAS aspirants, published by is the Top Now series, is available for pre-orders, the revised edition on Amazon by Wisdom Tree. Look forward to meeting you again next week. Thank you, and bye-bye till then.